Welcome to this episode of the Fourscore Project, a production of the New Majority Foundation. My name is Roger Clark, your host. This is the beginning of the Governor Pete Wilson series, a wide-ranging and intimate conversation with the former governor that explores a wide range of subjects and issues that are both topical and timely to California and the nation. Pete Wilson was the 36th governor of California from 1991 to 1999, a United States Senator from California from 1983 to 1991, and the 29th mayor of San Diego from 1971 to 1983. He is a United States Marine, serving on active duty from 1955 to 1958, a graduate of the UC Berkeley School of Law and Yale University. Governor Wilson, through his life and lifetime of public service, has given us a powerful example of what it means to be a leader for all the American people. A true American patriot, a man who can teach and instruct us today on the principles of statesmanship that all current political and business leaders should heed. In our first episode, Governor Wilson reflects on his close association with Ronald Reagan over the many years of their personal and professional relationship. And Governor Wilson shares his thoughts on what he sees as President Reagan's secret sauce for leadership for us in the 21st century.
I had the privilege of serving with Ronald Reagan twice. The first time was when he was elected governor, and I was in the same year elected to the state assembly. A good friend was George Deukmejian, and at one fundraising event, I think it was for him, I made the rather smart-ass comment when the president was kind enough to come by that we were happy that we were able to sweep him in on our coattails, which he tossed off. I did have the privilege of being in the legislature. I was the minority whip until we became the majority, and then I became a committee chairman. For 5 years, the last 5 years of Ronald Reagan's 2 terms as governor, I was very much an enthusiastic supporter. And that was true, but not nearly as significant as the great privilege I had of serving with him a second time, this time when he was president, serving for 2 terms, and for 6 of his 8 years, the last 6, I was in the United States Senate representing California, after quite an interesting campaign in which I managed to defeat the present United States Senator, Dianne Feinstein. It was a very interesting education serving in those roles. In particular, when I was on the Senate Armed Services Committee in the U.S. Senate, I had the privilege of being one of the loudest, most persistent voices in defending Ronald Reagan's initiative that his detractors referred to as Star Wars. People who knew what they were talking about, who were the backers of Star Wars, were people who said this is going to give us the edge in our dealings with the Soviet Union. And it did. There's no question about it. And there is no question that the Soviets knew that too. And they had one desperate try in which the then Soviet leader, Gorbachev, spent an afternoon in a small house in Reykjavik in Iceland. And as it happened, towards about the end of the afternoon, things seemed to be going well. The president was pleasantly surprised because Gorbachev seemed to be making concessions that he'd resisted before. But at the end of that afternoon, or almost the end, he called home, called Nancy, and she said, well, how's it going? And he said, well, it's going very well. In fact, I may be home for dinner. Well, when he returned from that, he sat down, and there were only 6 people in that little house, 2 interpreters. In addition to Gorbachev and the president, the only 2 others there were George Shultz and Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister. When they came back from the break, through the interpreter, Gorbachev said to the president, now, Mr. President, you do understand, of course, that all these concessions that I have made to you this afternoon are necessarily dependent upon your agreeing to abandon SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative.
What was derisively called Star Wars.
Correct. With that, Ronald Reagan lost his temper. He rarely did. When he did, it was justified. And in this case, when he heard the interpreter say that, he slammed the notebook shut, turned to George Shultz, and he said, "Come on, George, we're out of here." And with that, he got up, put on his overcoat. Out the door he went with George Shultz right behind him, trying to persuade him to stay, was Gorbachev. Didn't work. And the photographs are quite clear because Reagan was striding ahead. He was a very nice man, but he was angry. He felt that he had been played, so he was not listening. And Gorbachev was trying desperately to speak into his ear and persuade him to come back to the bargaining table. He didn't. But 10 months later, as you know, at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, he made the famous speech when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
So I gather, like so many of us, you're a great admirer of Ronald Reagan.
I was indeed. I remain so.
You knew Ronald Reagan personally, dealt with him on a one-to-one basis. Ronald Reagan, I think, in retrospect, is considered not only a great Republican president, but a great American. And you could see that at his funeral, how there's overwhelming support across all political lines.
Yeah. Well, he carried every state but one.
If you had to summarize his secret sauce, because we need so many people in politics, both at the state and national level now, we need some more of that Ronald Reagan secret sauce that can reach across the political divide and result in handshakes. What do you think was his political sauce that you could pass on to people now that are currently running for office?
Well, I think his great secret was that he was sincere, he made good sense, he was straight with the American people. He was straight with everybody, as he was with Gorbachev. He thought that this was, as it was then, the superpower of the universe. And he was someone who believed that our destiny was determined by our strength, that for as long as there were threats to that, he would maintain a vigorous, very strong, benevolent superpower status for the United States. Because he thought, and I think he was absolutely right, if we are a superpower so that they are fearful that we will have the resolve to use weapons and superior strength militarily. But he was also very much alive to the fact that a lot of people take for granted their freedom in this country. He has made the comment more than once publicly that freedom is only one generation away from extinction, by which he meant that you can't take it for granted. You cannot ignore people like Hitler, like Mao. They are dictators. They don't live and lead free countries. It could not be more different.
Just a few weeks ago, I was walking Omaha Beach with my wife. Took our time, a good mile and a half up and down Omaha Beach, and went up to Point to Hawk, where Colonel James Rudders, I think, led his Ranger Battalion up a 100-foot vertical cliff, took Point to Hawk, terrible fighting, vicious fighting. And if I recall right, that's where President Reagan in 1984, which is I think the 40th anniversary, stood at the very end of Point to Hawk and gave this wonderful speech about the
best.
What do you remember of that speech?
Well, he made it clear that the boys of Point du Hoc were owed an enormous debt of gratitude by the American people, and for that matter, by people striving to be free everywhere. And he was absolutely correct. It was more than just a good speech. You could tell that he believed every word of it. He was not just eloquent, but he was sincere. And it was one of the great speeches, and he made many, but I thought one of the finest. A lot of people who were not at Point du Hoc, but who had loved ones who did not come back, were in tears. And so were a lot of people who were just in tears because of the gratitude that he was expressing and the admiration. It was a great speech.
I've heard stories, and maybe you can reflect on this, that President Reagan drove the folks over in the State Department nuts from time to time. And what I have in mind is the speech you referenced about Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. He kept handwriting that into the speech, and the State Department kept...
That's true.
What are your reflections on that?
Well, it tells you two things about Ronald Reagan. One is that he had decided when he wrote it that he meant it and it should be said, because he wanted it to be very clear to Gorbachev and to others who were trying to support the Soviet Union that they were not going to succeed. I think that was a turning point. I think that Gorbachev and others in the Kremlin who hated the thought knew that they had come to a point where they had to abandon it. And tearing down the Berlin Wall, as he demanded, was about as vivid and sure a sign that he was serious and knew that if we had to, we would have the resolve that equaled the actual military strength that we possessed.
You know, that the tension between President Reagan, which I put on the side of good old common sense coupled with a tremendous backbone, versus the State Department, which I would classify as people who would be considered experts in foreign diplomacy. History has proved the experts wrong, the man with the common sense and the backbone right, which seems to be an issue to me that my perception is that, not just in the United States, but probably most places, we are deferring more and more to experts, supposed experts, whatever the field may be, as opposed to exercising our own common sense. Of course, one of our projects here about our educational function is to help people be informed so that they can bring their own common sense to the issues of the day. How do you feel about that tension between experts and deferring to experts and using common sense?
You know, Roger, the common sense was very uncommon. There were a lot of people who thought that was being provocative, that it was going too far. He didn't. He wanted Gorbachev to understand very clearly why he was demanding that they break down that wall, tear down this wall. And it was because what he wanted to say in so many words was, there is never going to be a time when we are willing to allow this to continue. The time has come for you to tear down this wall, which means to set free the people in East Germany, and for that matter, the so-called captive nations that he freed, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. The man said what he believed. He was not a bully, he was not ferocious, but by God, he meant it, and he made it clear. That's why he kept writing it back in every time the State Department speechwriters would put it back. I guess they thought they could wear him down. He was the guy with the last word.
Wanted to also touch base on his, sense of humor, which we seem to have lost a sense of humor politically. It's very rare to see someone now running for office that has a genuine sense of humor, and of course Reagan famously had a sense of humor. And you go back and look at his remarks now, we wonder, well, how did he get away with that? But he had that delivery and that talent. What's your thoughts on sense of humor in politics? Why are we losing it? If you agree with that, maybe you don't. Well,
I do. I mean, I think he used it in a way that made his point, but made people laugh. One of the best examples I can think of was his debate with Fritz Mondale. And I've forgotten who the reporter was who asked him a question. But the question was, do you have any concerns about your ability to discharge the heavy duties of the presidency? Do you think that your age is going to be a question? And he said, I have no intention of taking unfair advantage of my opponent's youth and inexperience.
His opponent was probably in his 50s at the time, or maybe 60s.
Yeah. And to his credit, Fritz Mondale burst into laughter. And so did the audience for this debate that was going on.
And he was all of Reagan, that is, at that time was very youthful by today's standards, 71,
by today's standards,
72. Well, let's talk about age. The current president is an octogenarian running again, who one of the primary candidates to have the Republican nomination, I guess, is closing in on an octogenarian. What's your thoughts on age in holding that office? We've always been a country focused on youth, as opposed to so many other countries where octogenarians are revered and looked at as the wise folks that should be running things. We have traditionally not been that way. We have gone the other way, youthful 40-something-year-old chiefs of state and things like that. What are your reflections on, as we're putting candidates out that are in their 80s voting, considering them for the White House? Is this a good thing, bad thing, or any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it has to be. The focus has to be on the individual, not just age, but health, energy, the ability to sustain that very tough schedule. And Reagan had it, these grueling schedules, not just during the campaigns, that's tough enough, but the travel, the meetings with his own staff, the meetings with members of Congress, with members of the public, all sectors of the public. And it's hard work. It requires concentration, it requires study, and it requires that you stay in shape, and he did. Reagan had all of those things. What we learned is that sadly he also had Alzheimer's. I pray to God that someday soon there will be a discovery that puts that one behind us. I think the answer to your question, Roger, is it depends on the individual.
That kind of triggers kind of a sensitive question because John Kennedy, although he was a youthful president, had a lot of medical issues that no one knew about publicly at the time. And if they had been known publicly, by today's standards, he probably would have been disqualified, at least by the voters. Arguably, maybe true, maybe not. But now when we are talking about people who are 40 years older that are running for that same office, how much is their private medical history fair game? How much of that do we need to have access to in order for the voters to make an assessment? Is that individual medically competent to discharge those strenuous duties?
I think that there is an absolute necessity for the medical experts who have examined it to be advised by the candidate that there is, in fact, the following bill of health. It may not be perfect health. It may be somebody has a heart condition. We've had people as vice president and president who have had some serious medical problems. But until Reagan suffered this terrible disease of Alzheimer's, he was a pretty tough guy. I mean, he sustained an assassination attempt.
And joked about it, I believe, in the emergency room.
Said to the surgeons who were taking care of him, he said, I hope all of you fellows are registered Republicans.
Which is a tremendous presence considering a life-threatening situation. Because I think we found out later that he was about a quarter of an inch away from us losing him. Very, very close thing. So I suppose he probably looked at that as a second chance for him at that point. Maybe it gave him increased devotion and dedication to his purposes.
I think it did. I think it did. He started with a very clear set of principles and goals. Dick Allen, who didn't know him well at the beginning of their relationship when they, I think, first met, Dick said to him, well, where are you in this issue of foreign policy? Tell me what you think. He said, it's very simple. We win, they lose.
It's a good policy.
And Dick burst into laughter and he said, you mean that? He said, you're damn right I do.
There's something that was a little bit of a boyishness in him, even regardless of his age, which I think is very healthy. And so many people in the world know this building as the Nakatomi Plaza. which Bruce Willis blew up about 30, 40 years ago. It's all been repaired very nicely now, so it's a very nice office. But I hear a story that when President Reagan was here, he was in one of the, I think the Century City Plaza, and someone had a meeting with him and could not find him. And he was late for the meeting, and somebody said, we need to go upstairs on the top floor. I think he's up there. And they went upstairs, and he found the president making paper airplanes out of White House stationery and throwing them out on Century Boulevard. So he's probably in his 70s, but is enjoying what I think most people consider to be a very boyish activity. But to me, that's kind of endearing, and I think that's healthy to still have a little bit of a youngster, whether you're a man or a woman, in you. And
well, he loved to go up to the ranch, and it's an unpretentious structure, but he loved being up there, and he would take guests, at least certain guests, up there for a weekend, or at least for a visit. I think he did it with the late Queen of England. But in any case, yeah, he enjoyed life. He enjoyed the outdoors. He loved working on the ranch. That was his idea of a good time, not having somebody paid for it. So he was a very wholesome guy, and he did have this wonderful sense of humor. As it happened, I had the good fortune, for which I was very grateful, that he made speeches for my campaign for governor. 9 speeches all over the state. The last performance that he gave was, I believe, at the College of the Desert, and the bill was not just Ronald Reagan, but Bob Hope. And they had an exchange, total ad lib, and it was hilarious, and the audience was beside themselves.
well, I guess that President Reagan had some stand-up comic in him as well. Sounds like he probably held his own with Bob Hope.
Well, they did. They were going back and forth and did it for about, at least 20 minutes. And finally, I think it was the president who said, well, Bob, it's been fun, but this is, after all, Pete's party, and we ought to let him get on. And to which I said, Mr. President, I am not a fool. After what you have just given this audience, if you think I'm going to make a serious speech, forget it.
Is that kind of a way of saying you're a hard act to follow?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful, wonderful stories. Thank you for joining us for this fascinating and informative discussion with former Governor Pete Wilson. My name is Roger Clark, your host for this episode of the Fourscore and 7 Project, a production of the New Majority Foundation. Please share and like us with your friends, and be sure to join us for part 2 of our conversation with Governor Wilson, where we will continue to explore the importance of honesty, the importance of debates, the challenges presented by the media, and the lessons of leadership Governor Wilson learned from his father.